Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and once again we're looking at Belbe Corrupted Observer, an updated version from Lexa that has changes from the previous time we've looked at it. Lexa has brought this deck to the front of the queue, and I want to thank them for supporting the channel. It really does mean a lot. We've seen some changes to this deck. We're going to take a look at it in a second. But I wanted to say that I do really like seeing the same deck changed a little bit because every time we look at a deck, a little further down its course of getting better, we can be more specific. We can see the ways it changes and we can see what direction the deck is moving in, right? I think, you know, our viewpoint on the deck is going to narrow as we get a better understanding of what needs to come, what needs to go, and therefore our critiques and our advice and the things we like about it will also grow more narrow. We'll be more able to kind of see what needs to be changed, what needs to be improved. As always, the deck list will be in the video description below, and I highly recommend you take a look at it. If you saw the original Belbe video, or you take a look at the deck list, it's great to take a look at this one. See what's changed, see if you like the direction it's going in, or if you have suggestions in another way. So, before we go any further, let's do a really quick recap of what Belbe does. Belbe is a 2/2 Golgari zombie elf that says at the beginning of each player's post-combat main phase, that player gets 2 colorless mana for each of your opponents that lost life this turn, which means generally the way this deck is played is that you want to deal at least 1 point of damage to each of your opponents in order to get 6 colorless mana on your post-combat main phase. It is a ramp deck. Once again, this ability does go over to your opponents. They can only get a total of 4 mana. Actually, that's not true. Now that I realize, if they can find a way to deal damage to themselves, they could get the full 6 mana. But even with that in mind, our plan is that we can use this extra mana much better than our opponents and get ahead before they can establish a game plan and, have a strong board, a strong, set of enchantments or artifacts, or something that just enables us to get incredibly far ahead before our opponents can finish setting up, putting us in the lead. Decks like this tend to have a mix of enablers, which have grown since last time, which I'm a fan of. These enablers are creatures or enchantments that will deal 1 damage to each of your opponents, therefore immediately activating Belbe. They are preferable to be 1 mana, or I will also say in one of my suggestions at 3 mana, because we just don't want them at 2 mana. Belbe is a lot more functional. You want turn 2 to cast Belbe, so we want to avoid using 2 mana enablers if we can. And then the rest of the deck is going to be cards that we can cast with the extra mana. There's a few things that we want to look for. Namely, we want to see that number 6 in the top right corner of 6 generic mana. This is really, really good because it means we can use the entirety of the mana we gain from damaging our opponents onto the spell. Whether it be like Wormcoil Engine, we're paying the entirety of it, or something like Archon of Cruelty, where that 6 mana will cover all of the generic mana cost, and the rest we're going to use just the black mana we have laying around. So those are the key numbers we're looking for. We're trying to hit them. And after that, the rest of the deck is going to be support spells for this kind of strategy, from card draw to removal to ramp. So, looking quickly at the curve, this matches pretty much what I expected to be, with 6 being higher. That's, I think, entirely correct. This is how this deck will be built. And something we want to note of is everything from this point on, 6 and above, should be bombs in the traditional sense. We say bomb, we say a card that, drastically changes the game for you and your opponents. So, for example, really simply, something like, getting an early Liliana Dreadhorde General will put you very far ahead of the game. In the same way, getting an early God Pharaoh statue will put your opponents very far behind in the game. If you can play this turn two with the combo the deck wants to do with, like, say, where is it? Mardu Shadow Spear turn one, Belbe turn two. Mardu Shadow Spear attacks anyone. Each opponent loses one life. You get 6 mana, and then you play God Pharaoh's statue. In all intents and purposes, you've probably locked out your opponents from playing the game for a few turns. That is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And so these are the kind of cards we want in this zone. We want to avoid any card that doesn't particularly, dramatically change the game. Chromatic Orrery, for example, is really good because it allows us to continue ramping, albeit it's at 7 mana, so you can't cast it on that second turn. However, once you play this, you have 5 additional mana going forward, which keeps our deck going. Anyways, we're going to go through more specific ones as we go through them, but this curve makes sense. I'm a big fan of it. I think straight up the deck has been cleaned up in a lot of ways that I'm really happy with. I really have little to say on the creature selection. I just have a few notes. I think it's very strong, and I'm just going to be kind of picking on a few cards and a few strategies that I think are either counterintuitive or not as strong as I think it could be. And at the same time, I'm going to make some suggestions where I think the deck could have a few cards here and there to improve. As I do sometimes, we're actually going to go backwards. We're going to start with lands and make our way all the way to battles. So lands, um, I think. So lands is something that I often wait until about this phase in the deck to talk about, because lands are the kind of thing that players don't often. You won't notice the difference of one or two lands because it's such a large grouping of cards that do generally the same thing, that adding an extra swamp here isn't really going to fundamentally change the deck. However, I'm going to suggest maybe we can think about adding one or two lands. It is a known fact that Commander players like going low on lands. I am guilty of this. I definitely build decks that have far too few lands, and I think 33 is just a little low. I wouldn't mind pushing that to 35 at least. I know we have a 2 mana commander. I know we have a ramp strategy, but in the long run, there's going to be situations where we need to hit our land drops past the third land. And I believe someone said in order to hit, like, I'm not sure, I did read this, so we'll take it with a grain of salt. But someone had suggested that you need at least 38 lands to reliably hit your fourth land on curve. 38 is a lot of lands. And I don't think that necessarily counts ramp or mana rocks or the like. So with that grain of salt or sand, take that with a grain of salt, right? I don't know. Regardless, I would move us to at least 35-ish lands. That way we still have our ramp strategy. We can still get to Belbe, but that we're comfortable getting to at least 3 mana and eventually 4, where a lot of our deck opens up. One of the things is, as noted in a lot of the decks I work on, is the mana value that is the same as our commander is particularly vulnerable because there's no 2 mana spell in this deck you would cast turn two outside of Belbe, right? Now, obviously there could be ridiculous circumstances where your friend turns to you and says, if you cast Belbe now, I'll counter her. Sure. But 99% of the time, Belbe is the correct turn to play. So with that in mind, our turn two slot isn't, you know, isn't extraordinarily strong, and that's fine. It's not meant to be. Belbe will carry it. So because of that, we want to hit at least 3 naturally off lands, and then 4 where we can really open things up. So with that in mind, I wouldn't mind 1 or 2 lands. What lands would I suggest? Well, I think you can play some of the off-color fetches. Right now we have Verdant Catacombs as our only fetch land. I'm not sure if this is a conscious choice or something that players sometimes forget. In Commander, you can play any fetch land. Whether or not it can actually fetch a land is dependent on your deck. but all the fetch lands are always legal because they do not have mana symbols on them. So having access to like Bloodstained Mire or any other ones that tap for that grab black or green is going to be fine. You're playing Bayou, and therefore I think it's free for you to be able to, every fetch becomes another version of Bayou, which I think is strong. And especially on MTGO, which this deck is meant to be legal for, fetches are very cheap, so I recommend just grabbing one or two. In fact, depending on budget, considering how cheap they are on MTGO, grab as many fetch lands as you can, honestly. You have the slots in your basics, and they'll always be able to grab at least one of your basics, Bayou, or where are you? Overgrown Tomb, right? And I think, yeah, Woodland Chasm, but you probably won't get to that point, right? So if you can put in the fetch lands, I think they'd be a nice, easy inclusion that just increases the reliability of your deck at little cost. All right, let's go to enchantments. So I think there's at least two here that I don't like as much. I love Obika, the Reckoner raid. I really, really like that. I think that's great. Protection Racket is a little strange. This is one of those black give your opponents a choice, and one of those choices, and the choice is between giving you a card and losing life spells. There's a few of these, right? Um, and I think this is especially the kind of deck you don't want that in. These kind of effects are really, really strong when you can give consistent pressure against your opponents. Think like Obosh, who doubles all the damage that comes from 3 mana permanence, which I'm realizing doesn't work with this. This is why I'm hesitating all of a sudden. But regardless, if you have a deck that can put consistent and strong pressure on your opponent's life totals, that might make them think twice about protection rackets. That's really strong. The problem here is that yes, we have really high mana cost cards, but a lot of them are either integral to our game plan or just, you know, really, really not worth the life that your opponent can pay to just get rid of it. Hoarding Broodlord, for example, or as mentioned before, God Pharaoh's statue. If you flip this, you know, and I'm the opponent, I will always pay the 6 life. And you might say, well, Curse Deck Builder, I just paid 3 mana to do 6 damage to you, and maybe more damage over the next few turns. Yeah, I get that, but sometimes you're going to flip up lands. Sometimes you're going to flip other cards. Your commander is a 2/2, and not every one of your creatures is going to be able to damage multiple opponents at the same time. So it's very difficult to maintain that pressure following up with that 6 damage. Because the situation you want, excuse me, is that I'm at 15 life and you flip God Pharaoh statue. When I'm at 15 life, I need to think pretty hard about whether or not I want to pay 6 life. However, this deck has a really hard time doing this, and so I don't think it's a particularly strong card here. Another example, of course, is Oblivion Sower, where if you flip that, that could be integral to your game plan. This could be the card that ramps you into the next few spells and establishes you a defensive board, while you take on the ire of 3 other players. Or, Psychosis Crawler, a card that represents so much potential damage. More potential damage, I would say, than Protection Racket itself. I'm very happy to discard those cards. And then every time you play a land or something that I deem like, turn 10, you flip Pulse Tracker. Yeah, take the Pulse Tracker. It's fine. I think this is a fine card, but it's never going to be card draw when you want it to be, and it's never going to be damage when you want it to be. So I think it's particularly weak. Retreat to Hagra is great, deals damage per land, which enables Belbe. It's at 3 mana, so it's not at 2. I like that, but because of how it's worded, you can't play Belbe turn 2 and then play this turn 3 and trigger it. That's something I'm a little worried about, but I think it's a consistent enough trigger and benefits from the Belbe trigger to reduce it to 1 mana that I'm gonna leave it. I think it's fine. Actually, I think it's better than fine. I think it's good here, despite it has a little bit of clunkiness to it. And if you're in a situation where you have a hand, that goes that the only enabler is retreat to Hagra, you might want to not cast Belbe right away if you can avoid it, or cast Belbe with the intention of knowing you won't be able to trigger her. Um, just because in the sense that maybe there's situations where your opponents will benefit from the mana before you do. However, even then, I'm thinking, turn 3 you can attack with Belby, then pay 1 mana for this. You know, it's not the worst. I think this is perfect. This is perfectly fine. Ugin's Mastery is a new card. I think this is fantastic. I think this is great. We're going to come back to the colorless creature clause. It's something that I want to talk about, but I think this is a very good addition. Subversion, however, this I have a hard time with because I get why it's here. It is a Belby, it is a Belby enabler that is much harder to interact with than most of the other creatures, right? A lot of the other cards are creatures and therefore can easily be removed. And like something like Obika Reckoning Raid, it flips eventually, so it just doesn't go endlessly. So Subversion represents every turn draining 1 life. But 5 mana is a lot of life. And sorry, just to pause. I said drain 1 life. It doesn't actually do that. Draining it, this may be just like colloquialisms, but like in it nowadays, a lot of the cards will take 1 life from all of your opponents and give you just 1 life in return. The fact that this gives you 3 life every upkeep is considerably stronger, but still, I think wholly kind of irrelevant. That damage is never going to add up to anything. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts is not where this deck wants to be. You want to drop bombs, and you don't want this to be the spell that you drop Belby's mana into. Like it has an odd mana, generic mana number, so you can't even put a full. If you get 2 triggers, you can't put the full 4 into this, which means you're already wasting mana to an extent. And once again, it just doesn't do enough. By the time you are able to do this, you are either already using Belby's ability and ramping ahead, or something has gone really, really wrong and you're scrambling to to enact your plan B. And during your plan B, you don't want to be casting Subversion. You want to be casting other cards to get yourself ahead. So with that in mind, not a big fan of Subversion. Going to artifacts, I really do like this collection. I really like Netherborn Altar here. I think I would have been really picky about it in other decks, but I think it's really, really good here because Belby is very susceptible to being hated out, and this is a really good way of keeping her in play. Um, the Immortal Sun. Let's finish the list. I'm going to come back. Darksteel Monolith. I just want to take a moment to talk about this. I think this is an excellent addition from the new colorless commander deck. I think this works really, really well here. And once again, much like Ugin's Mastery, we have a bit of a colorless spell theme that I'm going to return to when we get to our additions. But let's talk about the Immortal Sun. So the Immortal Sun has a bit of tension in this deck. I think it's a very strong card here. I think the fact that it's 6 mana makes it very clean to play. I love the fact it draws you extra cards. I love your spells get cheaper. I love your creatures get stronger. This is just a fantastic card. However, it turns off your planeswalkers, and at this point, we have a rather large collection of planeswalkers. With that in mind, I'm going to skip over to the planeswalkers so we can talk about them in earnest. And I'm going to suggest we go from 5 to like 3. And what I'm going to suggest is we're going to keep only the strongest ones. So Ugin the Ineffable, obviously one of the strongest cards just in the deck in general. Improves your colorless spells, costs 6 to drop down, so already it is it's already in that right mana frame that we want, and its abilities are very, very relevant. It's just a fantastic card. So Ugin the Ineffable is not going anywhere. Ugin the Spirit Dragon, once again, almost for the same reasons, it's going to stay. Is not. It is sometimes really strong, sometimes not. Don't get me wrong. If you play Ugin the Spirit Dragon in one-on-one, you've probably won the game. But in a 1-on-3, or because that's what's going to happen when you play Ugin, is your opponents are immediately going to work together to destroy it or defeat you, it's okay. It's you can use it to wipe the board and hopefully keep it around after that. But it's probably, kind of a board wipe. I still think it's really strong. I'm not suggesting taking it out, but just be aware that like Ugin the Ineffable is much, much stronger because it represents proactive power, whereas Ugin is the Spirit Dragon is kind of a reactive spell and a reactive planeswalker, but still very strong. So we're left with three others. Liliana Dreadhorde General, I would say, without a doubt, is the strongest of the group. I think I don't think that's a question. And then this is the one I would recommend you keeping. But just for a moment, let's look at the others. Vivian of the Hunt is a particularly strong card, but its primary ability of birthing pod a creature, where you sacrifice a creature, you get one that's the next mana value, and you put it into play, isn't great here because there's definitely like you have a lot of one drops. That's the whole point, right? And so you'd want to use Vivian to turn them into stronger creatures. But you'll notice we go from Vicious Conquistador to Fleshbag Marauder. You actually have no two drops in your creatures, which once again is fine. It makes sense with Belbe as your commander. However, that does mean that your Vivian on the Hunt can't actually turn your one drops into anything relevant. And so her +2 is kind of um, weak for your lower creatures. You also can't grab your three drops, which you don't have that many, but you can't grab them because you don't have a 2 mana creature to sacrifice outside of Belbe, which I'm going to suggest 9 times out of 10 you don't want to sacrifice. After that, we get to questing. We get to the 4 mana drops. There's only a single 5 mana drop, so if Psychosis Crawler is not in your deck, you can't actually tutor for it. I believe she pulls out of the deck. Let's see. Yeah, she pulls out of the deck. So if Psychosis Crawler is for any reason not nearby, your 4 drops don't turn into anything. And if you want your 5 drop to turn into a 6 drop, well, it has to be Psychosis Crawler, which is a very strong card, so it feels kind of bad to sacrifice. Once again, after 6, there's only a single 7. And I feel like I've kind of made my point, but to just leave it on the full note is that Vivian on the Hunt's +2 is just not a strong card within this deck. You can suggest that we're only using her for her +1 then, where you mill 5 and put a creature, any number of creature cards milled this way in your hand. I'm going to even suggest that's not the strongest because we have a pretty low creature count. 23 is lower than you'd think for a number of creatures. Now, it makes sense in this deck, so it's not a problem, but Vivian of the Hunt just does not play well. So what you're probably going to do is you're going to cast Vivian and minus her for a Rhino each turn. And that's not particularly great, is what I would suggest. So I think Vivian of the Hunt is an easy cut. Ob Nixilis of the Black Oath, I think, like Subversion, which is what his plus does, 5 mana for this ability is just 5 mana for Subversion is just too much. It's just too late in the game. Um, Creating 5/5s, I think, is fine, but not where this deck wants to be. For the amount of mana and like if you think in the sense that the free spells or the powerful spells you can cast using Belbe, they tend to be better than 5/5s, right? They're Eldrazi or giant, dragons or archons, right? And so if instead you're just getting a flying 5/5, obviously the 2 life doesn't particularly matter, but you're not getting the best deal here. And so I find this to be a particularly weak planeswalker. So I would cut Obnixilis and Vivian, keep the other 3 around. That way, even, you get to feel a little better about keeping the Immortal Sun, especially since the Immortal Sun isn't a problem for Ugin the Ineffable, because really you're using him for his passive, and to an extent, though not as much, Liliana Dreadhorde General has a very strong passive as well. So the fact that the Immortal Sun doesn't completely shut them down is rather nice. So all in all, I think if you cut down to 3, you wouldn't have a problem there. Okay, Quickly, I'm going to move on to the last few cards that I think stand out, and then we're going to move on to additions. Unmake the Graves feels very, very strange here. Um, if you want this kind of effect, why doesn't it reanimate the creatures? Its convoke ability, I don't think is particularly strong here because you're not making that many creatures, and even if you are, that this is not the ability you want, right? You want to reanimate the creatures. You don't want to just put them back into your hand. So this stands out as being particularly weak. Rest of the instants are fine. Um, Breach the Multiverse is the reanimator spell you want, so I think this is fantastic here. But Entertainment feels a little strange. This is a very complicated card that doesn't really do as much as you want. Think about it this way. So you have to pick two players and they control each other's turns. So you haven't added to the board, you haven't changed the setup, and you haven't, you're just gonna, the game is just gonna be played with an additional rule. If you pick two players that aren't you, those players there's a lot of things that can happen that stop you from getting what you want. First example is those two players might look at each other and say, hey, do you want to spend our stolen turns with each other? Attacking you, the Belbe player, because you messed up their game plan by trading their turns. I think that's a really easy response to this card, and so that's not going to be good for you. Alternatively, if those two players you pick hate each other, it doesn't really change much if they don't have the right cards in their hands to kind of, you know, take advantage of the fact that they've taken each other's turn. Now, they can, if they have the right boards, because they can attack into themselves and they still have control over themselves and therefore can make bad blocks or positive or really good blocks, I should say, in order to destroy the board. But that's once again, it's dependent on cards, it's dependent on boards. If you pick two other players, whoever goes first is a lot stronger than the other, which is going to lead into my second point that if you pick yourself and another player, um, their player, you'll take their. Oh, Sorry, I did misunderstand it. Since they'll be going first, you'll take control of their turn first, which is fine. And I think that's the strongest way to play this card. But unless you can then defeat that player, you are going to be next on the list, you know, of turns to be taken. And you losing a turn is a lot worse, especially early on, because think about it like this. Let's say you start a really strong game where you have Belbe out and you're able to ping all your opponents every turn. You're getting 6 additional mana a turn. And so you, with one of your extra black manas, you cast this spell. You take their turn, you attack their creatures into your Wormcoil engine, mess up you skip their land drop, or you fetch and not grab anything. You've put them really far behind. But if this was one of the early turns, there's kind of a ceiling of what they can do and what you can do in their turn, right? Because they only have so many mana, they only have so many cards. There's not much you can do. Whereas when they come back to your turn, you have potentially at least 6 ramp mana from Belbe that they can just waste or they can just use against you. And I think that's going to be just so much more detrimental when they take control of your turn than the other way around. So I don't know. I really don't like this card. I think it feels really cool and you can do some really clever plays in it. But if you don't know everything, which you can't because you can't always know what your opponents have in hand, like if you're dealing with information you don't have, this card could be just bad for you. And so even if you're really clever and make the most of it, I think it's too much of a threat to the deck to allow this to happen. So I really recommend taking this out. Last one I'm going to talk about is Last March of the Ents. Um, I think this is a very decent card. The only thing I want to say, as mentioned before, we're kind of on a low creature count. And so I want to keep this, but I want to up the number of creatures we have so that we can guarantee that we'll be getting as many creatures in play as possible. Which I think, unless I've missed anything, which I haven't, I'll quickly say I like the battles. I think they're very good inclusions here. Um, But with that, I'm going to transition to the cards I will add because I'm hoping that a lot of them are creatures so that we can take advantage of these kinds of abilities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through colors and I'm going to go black, green, colorless of adding kinds of cards that I think the deck would benefit from, either as additional ideas of finishers, since we're taking out some of the bigger mana cards, or additional enablers. So, first of all, I have an extra enabler here, Loyal Subordinate. This is a 3-drop that I think is really worth playing because when you have Belbe and Loyal Subordinate out, Loyal Subordinates on combat will deal the 3 damage across the board, and then you will get the Belbe trigger. This is kind of a response to cards like Subversion, where this just costs considerably less mana. This is potentially 1 mana if you use Belbe's mana, but otherwise curves right after Belbe really, really nicely. And it's got a kind of funny way of doing its ability that works really well. Think of Subversion. Subversion doesn't do anything for you if you don't have Belbe out, right? It just drains a little bit of life. Whereas Loyal Attendant literally doesn't work if Belbe isn't out. So when you want this ability with Belbe out, and that's when Loyal Subordinate triggers. So all its text about Lieutenant is kind of meaningless to you. It's just a card that works with Belbe. It costs considerably less mana than Subversion. I think you should play it. This is generally just another general black card just to consider. Toxic Deluge. I think you have the one board clear Battle at Fiora. It wouldn't hurt just to have the second one. I've been recommending it a lot because it just got reprinted both in Lord of the Rings and in the new Commander Masters. I think it's just worth picking up. And the fact that it comes down to 1 black mana with Belbe is really, really good. Um, Plus, because you have so many higher mana drop, bigger creatures that have tons of toughness, you can make this into a one-sided board clear pretty easily, and that's one of the main benefits of Toxic Deluge. So, big recommend here. Absolutely consider using it. I have one more here for utility more than a payoff. Painful Quandary. So this is an interesting one. I'm not gonna necessarily just say play this, but I want you to think about this. And if this one doesn't work, there are alternatives, but I want you to think about this kind of card. What I mean by that is one of the downsides of Belbe is your opponents are gaining tons of mana too. So I want to use a card, even just 1 copy or an extra copy, because God Pharaoh's statue kind of works this way. Actually, God Pharaoh's statue doesn't work that way because you use Belbe's mana to counteract it. Don't mind that. I mean, I want a card that counteracts the fact that we're giving our opponents free mana. So Painful Quandary counteracts it by, slowly stressing their hand, and late game when they, have, let's say, almost infinite mana, right? Where they can maybe trigger Belbe at least 2 times. They have 6 other mana. Whatever card they draw off the top of their deck, they'll be able to cast most likely. Then Painful Quandary is really, really strong because it just tells them you're going to lose 5 life every time you do this. Nice and easy. I think this is going to be really worth it. If not, there's a few other cards we can look into that will just kind of stress your opponent's hands or stress their life total for them casting spells. And that's going to enable you to get really, really far ahead because now they can't just look at Belbe and say, hey, this is just a bonus right now. I also think Painful Quandary is one of those cards that even though it has the same mana cost as Subversion and has the same downsides that I've mentioned before, where you can't use 4 colorless mana on it, you have to use 3 and leave 1 out. I think this is really, really strong as an early play because the amount of damage and triggers it's going to get is just going to be really, really high throughout the game. This is definitely going to do more damage than Subversion, and this thing's main purpose of stressing your opponent's hands and dealing damage over time is going to be much stronger. So I just want you to think about that. Two big mana spells that I want you to also consider, not necessarily need to play. Cut of the Prophets is kind of interesting because it allows you to funnel all the excess mana you've been making into a draw spell. And the casualty 3 is surprisingly relevant. You have a lot of ways to trigger it once you get past the initial like 1 mana bump. And I think it can allow you to draw into a lot of cards. And then if you have, mana reducers, if you have Ugin the Ineffable, if you've got extra Belbe triggers that you didn't use, or extra Belbe mana, you can really draw quite a few cards and start casting those cards instantly, which would put you very far ahead. However, this is the kind of card that just plain doesn't do anything if you don't meet those requirements. So I'm a little hesitant on that, as I am a little hesitant on Torment of Hailfire. It's just a classic finisher in big mana black, and it's just really, really strong. Being able to just pump 6 mana into this for free, basically, and then add the rest of your mana makes this into an incredibly powerful damage spell. However, as mentioned before, it really doesn't do anything outside of that. So, with that in mind, I don't know if it necessarily fits, but it's a card I'd like you to think about. Going to green, I have one suggestion as well. Another big flashy spell. I've said these are going to be creatures, but so far I've only added one. So here's the second creature. Our second creature is Apex Devastator. Apex Devastator is a huge fan favorite, I think. It has Cascade, I believe, 5 times on it. 1, 2, 3, 4 times. And basically meaning that this spell is actually 5 spells. It's itself a 10/10, but you also get 4 additional cards off the top of your deck. And with the idea being that this is the strongest card in your deck. Now, despite what I just suggested, this card actually works very poorly with Torment of Hailfire and Cut of the Prophets because X spells do not cascade well. But outside of that, I think Apex Devastator is absolutely playable. I think, without additional mana, this can be played as early as turn 4 with the Belbe triggers. And the effect of it is just so, so strong. If you don't know, Cascade triggers on cast, so you don't have to worry about this being counterspelled. This is just a card you can play, immediately drawing and playing 4 separate spells. I think it's really, really strong. However, it is a card that just rots in your hand if you don't have the combo going, and you need to consider that. You also cannot get this effect by reanimating it. You have to cast the card. So just be aware. This has a really, really high ceiling, and I think you can jump through the hoops of this card pretty easily, but it's worth considering. All right, I have a few more colorless cards to add in. This was the only green card I wanted to add. And though I'm going to only suggest 5 colorless cards, I think it's worth maybe considering a few more yourself, because you do have, as I mentioned before, that colorless creatures and colorless cards matter theme. And I think it's pretty good for you to be able to lean into that a little further. So Crashing Drawbridge is really nice in this deck, I think. It's 2 mana, it's a 2 mana creature, so it does compete with Belbe, but it's not a problem because that's not what it's intended to do. This is a card you can cast when you have just a little extra Belbe mana or a little extra mana, and its ability to give your creatures haste is just such a boon that you're going to enjoy for the rest of the game, where all your really strong big creatures are going to come out, and you're going to immediately turn after turn give them haste, start being able to swing right away. I think this is great. I think it is just a utility creature that doesn't really help your main game plan, but how do I do it? It accentuates it maybe. It just makes it stronger when you are doing what you want to do. And if nothing else, it's a 0/4 defender that is easy to cast, so you don't have much of a problem with it. I think it's good. Another one, Solemn Simulacrum. I don't know if this was in the original build. I didn't check. I don't know if maybe I suggested it not being there, but I think it just can easily fit in here, and it can ramp you further along. It's not the strongest card, but now that you have more colorless matter themes, I want to see this card in here. Like, it's gained value. And with that in mind, I think you can just get away with playing it because there's situations where you'll cast this card for free and it'll let you just get ahead. But also, there's going to be situations where you can't get Belbe out, and you want to increase your mana like just by ramping naturally, and Solemn Simulacrum does that. So pretty nice and easy. Here's maybe a contentious one, the One Ring. The One Ring is an incredibly powerful spell. It's obviously very, very strong in one-on-one formats, but there's no reason to think it's not also very strong here. The fact that it's a colorless draw spell that grows in power each turn cycle, I think it's just really good. I think it's pretty easy for you to play it in this deck. It is a little tricky, and the life loss can eventually matter because if you can't get rid of it yourself, it is going to eventually knock you out of the game. But in the meantime, you're going to be drawing tons and tons of cards, and hopefully with that, you can win the game or lock your opponents out of the game. I'm a little hesitant, but I think it would be really fun to try. So I think I absolutely suggest this. Two more. Wandering Archaic. Archaic. They said they were gonna in the new in the colorless deck print another Archaic. I was hoping something like this, where it was a two-sided card, but they didn't do that. They just did a one-sided card, which I think works completely different. So ignore that one, and here's the classic. Wandering Archaic is a very, very strong colorless creature. It lets you get very, very far ahead, and it pressures your opponent's mana in the way that they have to use their Belbe triggers to get past it. And I just said it out loud, and now I'm getting a little less interested in this card. I would have to play with this. A part of my brain says, okay, so it costs all their spells to basically cost 2 more, which means they have to either use the Belbe triggers for that and therefore can't ramp, or they're going to use the Belbe triggers to ramp into really good spells, and then they can't pay the 2, and you're going to get a copy of it. This is a pseudo-political card that's just going to be like, you're going to have to play with it to find out what people do. Because if people more often than not will take the risk and cast the big spell with the extra mana you've given them, you're going to be pretty happy to get a copy of that. If all it's going to do is nullify the Belbe triggers, then you've spent 5 mana for a 4/4 that does nothing. We'll have to see. I really think this card can be really good, but it just requires testing. And just the memory that if they're casting board clears and the like, this isn't a particularly strong card to have on the board because the board clear being copied doesn't do much. Though there are situations where that's actually really beneficial. If you need a board clear, but the person with the largest board is holding up counter magic, something like this can enable that board clear to come through even through counter magic. But that's pretty niche. This card has a backside. I don't know if people cast the backside. Each player looks at the top 5, reveals a land and/or instant sorcery card, then puts the cards they revealed this way into their hand, which means you get an instant or sorcery, right? Because it says either a land or an instant or is it? Can you get 3 cards? I don't think it matters. I'm just gonna skip it because I don't think it particularly matters. The main thing is that you can let everyone draw up to maybe 1 or 2 cards, and then they ramp, and then they gain life. I don't think you want this. I don't think you're gonna cast it for this unless you're desperate for the mana. But it is a neat secondary card that you get for free for playing this. So consider it. All right. Last thing on the list is Zuladoc. Zuladoc says colorless spells you cast from your hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade. It is worth noting that at this moment you are playing 3 spells that are colorless that will trigger this. So at this moment, I am not suggesting you play this card, but I am putting it on the list because I'd like you to consider it. I think if you ever wanted to switch into a more, even more colorless version of the deck, this card could be really, really good. The fact that it's 6 mana puts it at a really, really good number. As we said many times before, 6 mana is the ideal number because 1 Belbe activation puts Zuladoc into play. After that, you're going to have to see. There's going to be very few cards in your deck that trigger this, but when they are triggered, it's just going to be so good. You're just going to get so far ahead with that ability. So I don't want you to put this in your deck, but I want you to think about it. I think this is a card that could be really, really powerful in certain builds of the deck. All right, we've gone on for quite a bit of time. I'm trying to put a little more time into these decks as they need, but we'll see how it goes. This, of course, being a second draft, I have a lot more specific things to say. I really like the direction it's going in, and I would love to see more of this deck. I hope everything I've said has been helpful or guided you towards certain directions. I'm sorry if some of the cards are MTGO, not MTGO legal. I try to pick all the cards that I have seen on MTGO. If I've missed a few, I'm sorry about that, but in the main way, I think a lot of the strategies and ideas will work on MTGO as well. Um, I'm excited to see a new draft of this deck after. If you'd like to send me that draft, or if you'd like to send me another deck, or if anyone would like to send me a deck or a draft, there is a form in the comment section, sorry, the video description below. And if you too would like to skip the lineup, there is a link in there that allows you to do so. And as always, if you could like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, or whatever YouTube things you need to do, I would appreciate it if you would. Our channel is still growing. It's growing very steadily, and I'm very proud of it. And in the meantime, any support you give towards the channel is greatly appreciated. I really like this Belbe deck. I really like the direction it's going into. I think it has the makings of a very, very strong deck, and I'm really interested in seeing how it grows. All right. Good luck.